All right. Thanks everybody for tuning in for our latest installment of the Veterans for All Voters Reformation series, where we interview thought leaders to go deeper on the conversation of election reform and the power that military veterans can have in influencing this conversation. Super excited to be spending a few minutes with someone I really admire, who has a new book out, Nick Troiano, who is the founding executive director of Unite America, a philanthropic venture fund that invests in nonpartisan election reforms to foster a more representative and functional government. Um, on a personal note, Nick is in United America is a funder of Veterans for All Voters, an early adopter of what we were doing, and has been a real key support for us. So I say that not just in the spirit of transparency, but in the spirit of authenticity, that he's living what he is preaching to really drive change in the American political system. Most recently, just published, he's the author of The Primary Solution, Rescuing Our Democracy from the Fringes, which we're going to talk about what's in the book, why he wrote it, and what we can all do to enact some of the things that are shared there. But since 2019, United America has invested over $50 million to help win major statewide ballot initiatives and support state legislative and municipal victories, as well as build this movement of nonpartisan election reform. Nick himself is a former candidate, having run for the House of Representatives in 2014 as an independent, and so speaks to that experience in very personal ways. Distinguished career before that with career credentials and diplomas from Georgetown University, and has been featured in a number of documentaries. So, Nick, it's great to have you. Thank you for spending a few minutes with the Veterans for All Voters audience.
Such a big fan, so it's a pleasure to be here.
So the book is fantastic, and we'll get into it. But I just want to sort of frame this in a broader way. You know, Americans are distraught, or maybe disgusted at the state of politics in the United States. We're heading into an election cycle. What has been your journey, just as an American, as a college student, then into being a candidate? You know, obviously flexing as an independent, and ultimately as an entrepreneur and founder of United America. How did you come to the point of view about what's broken and how we fix it?
Well, like many Americans, I am also and have been for quite some time disillusioned by our political system, disappointed in the lack of results that it produces on issues that I really care about. And my journey has been one of understanding what's underneath a lot of the dysfunction and division that we see every day. I think on the surface, it's really easy to believe that the biggest divides in our politics are one of left versus right, Democrats versus Republicans. And to think about, at least in the old years, the fight over the size of government, or now in the culture wars, whether you use your pronouns or not, like these are the dividing lines in our politics. But I actually think they're not. I think the more important division that really exists in our politics is between people who see democracy as a cudgel, as we are in this to get our way and impose our viewpoint on others, and therefore winning becomes the only and most important thing, versus on the other side of that line, people who see democracy as what we do together. It's not kumbaya, let's all get along, but it is about common purpose of thinking about our role in this country as we are all Americans, and we're in this to find common ground on issues that we care about. And so that perspective that I've learned just by engaging in our political system has really informed my belief that the division that manifests on the surface is what a lot of people focus on, the candidates, the personalities, the divisiveness on issues. But that's all reflective of underlying incentives that is motivating a lot of that behavior. And that there's actually a whole group of people that might not agree on every policy, but are agreeing on that we should fix those underlying incentives. So that's one area of our politics that's become clearer to me over the past decade or so of just being active and trying to make a difference.
Mm. And I think that view is so, on the one hand, it seems so obvious and normal to sort of say, like, I think that we should have politics that reflect the sentiment of the will of the people, and irrespective of whether that's my sentiment, that like I want a system alignment such that the system elects people that represent the majority views of their populations that they represent, which we know sort of is not happening. So what is then the primary problem and the primary solution, which is what you lay out in your book?
Yeah, well, so when I sort of ask myself after having this journey and learning and working with others and being active in our politics, what's the one thing that we can change to improve the incentives of sort of political actors in the system? In my mind, I developed this conviction that party primaries are not the panacea or the silver bullet to fixing it all, but is the single most effective thing we can do to change the outcomes that we are all so disappointed with in our politics today. The reason for that is because primaries dictate effectively the outcomes of most of our elections. You know, most of our November elections aren't competitive between the parties, so it's really the election in which the parties nominate their candidates that decides who gets elected. And the problem is that there are millions of Americans who are disenfranchised from participating, including the nearly half of Americans who identify as independent in 15 states. And those who do participate, who are able to participate, tend to be the more partisan and ideological voters. So we've created a system that for most elected officials to get into office or to stay in office, you have to pander to the 8% of your party base rather than campaign to and be responsive to a majority of your constituents. That, I think, is the underlying challenge and why we see a Congress that can't agree on anything, even when a vast majority of Americans can. I think about aspects of immigration reform, for example. You can get 70 or 80% of Americans agreeing that we should have more border security, we should have a path to legal status for undocumented Americans brought here as children, right? But these seemingly are intractable problems in Congress, in part because they're not rewarded for solving these problems. It's quite the opposite. They're rewarded for scoring political points just by pandering to their side. So that's the primary problem. The primary solution is quite simple, which is to abolish party primaries. You know, we created these elections a century ago. They served their purpose for most of that time. They've now become the worst form of what the reformers 100 years ago envisioned, and we can fix them. And the solution isn't to go back to the old smoke-filled rooms. The solution is to get rid of the bifurcated nature of these elections and instead move to all candidate primaries where every eligible voter can support any candidate regardless of party. The top finishers go to the general election and majority wins. And what this is really all about is getting back to a government that has the consent of the governed. You can't have that consent if only 8% of people are electing most members of Congress. This is about a true way of majorities of voters being able to express themselves.
Mm. I mean, and it sounds so sort of obvious, and in fact, and there's data on this that most Americans like actually think that this is the way it works in a lot of cases. They think that people have to earn the majority of votes in order to win. You don't in most places. Um, and yet, I think for me, and I want to get your perspective on this, you know, there's a little bit of a learning journey of having played within that construct of uh, playing within the boundaries, I'll say, you know, and saying that the game is sort of constructed, but it's all within the boundaries. And eventually you hear this is the most important election of our lifetime. You're funneling money to candidates on your side who just sort of walk to re-elections uncontested. Um, People are getting older, you know, in office, you're not seeing sort of fresh competition, fresh ideas. So I get to the point of saying I'm dissatisfied with sort of playing the game as it has been constructed, as I've tried to do for decades, and begin to look beyond it, and which is what leads me to election reform. What are you saying? Because as you talk, it's so compelling. It seems so simple. What what is the appetite that you're seeing from donors and from the political industrial complex to say it is in fact somewhat obvious what you're arguing for? Shouldn't we sort of all embrace it? Are you seeing what is holding people back from embracing it? What have you seen over the last several years doing this work, leading United America as the changing appetite?
Yeah, first I would say this thesis is not intuitive. When you ask people what's wrong with politics, the most common answer is someone saying another politician's name, you know, whether that be MTG, AOC, Biden, Trump, etc. for the people who get to some sort of systemic challenge, you often hear about money in politics, the lack of term limits, maybe gerrymandering if you're lucky. When we did our polling, only about 2% of people said party primaries are a problem or a major problem in our democracy today. So the baseline is that this is an issue that has flown below the radar, and it's because it doesn't get much attention. And even the politicians don't talk about this issue as a way of finding political advantage, unlike some other maybe reform issues where it's more salient among voters. Now, I do think that's beginning to change. And the reason why I think it's beginning to change is there's been three sort of major trends that have made the primary problem much worse now than it used to be. The first is the large and growing segment of the electorate that is leaving both parties and becoming independents. You know, that number is 20% higher today in closed primary states than it was a decade ago. So you have more people who are being left out or locked out of the system. You know, the second is that we've had a dramatic decline in the number of districts that are truly competitive between both parties. You know, between the late 90s and the early 2020s, we have lost nearly half of the number of competitive seats that we used to in Congress, which means for all those seats, it's now the primaries that are dictating the outcome, not the general elections. And then finally, we've been able to see the impact in much more acute ways of political dysfunction. It's not just that there's gridlock on this issue or that, it's that we don't have a House Speaker for 2 weeks, we can't govern, or that the existential nature of elections have gotten to be so great that some people view it as okay to try and overturn the result of an election or not concede an election. These things, have not happened in our recent history up until now. So I think all of those trends are why more and more people are coming around to identifying primaries as a big problem that need to be addressed.
Yeah, I mean, just reflecting on Congress, I mean, the standard of like that people are doing victory laps to just pass continuing resolutions to keep the government going and not sort of going into default seems sort of shocking. And yet we have to sort of stay tuned into the fact that this is not normal. We should actually have a higher standard, a higher bar, and to not give up on an expectation for that. So a lot of us, I think American consciousness is such because of the divided nature of government, because of the presidential election, which takes so much oxygen out of the room. Americans are, in a state of fear about what's going to happen, depending on who you plan to vote for. And so that's a very pessimistic image. Are you optimistic about things? What are you seeing as opportunities around the primary solution, and from where you sit and from the audiences that you engage with, where are the opportunities to change election laws or get something better in our political system?
Yeah, well, as I point out in the book, there are 5 states that have so far abolished party primaries, either for state or federal office. You have Nebraska, which did so in the 1930s. You have Washington, 2004. To go back one, you have Louisiana, 1970s, California, 2010, Alaska, 2020. So it's been a sort of slow pace of change. Now, since Alaska did this in 2020 and it implemented it in 2022, which is the first top 4 primary of its kind, so different flavor than the other states I mentioned, it really inspired a lot of people to look at potentially doing this in other states, again, because of the political moment I think we're living in. And so this year, there are 6 states that right now are working to qualify ballot initiatives for November that would give voters the option of adopting these reforms in their own state. Nevada is already on the ballot, but some of the other states that are working on it right now include Montana, Idaho, South Dakota, Colorado, and Arizona. So this could be one of the biggest years since the progressive era a century ago, where we, the people, take the tools that our founders gave us and apply them to fixing democracy in our own terms for our own times. And that's why I'm really optimistic about 2024, even though it is a year where politics will be very divisive, especially in the presidential context. At the state level, we're using these tools to fix what we see, as wrong as in our democracy. And even if it's just a couple of these states were to win, I think it will build momentum towards what we can see by 2026, which happens to be the 250th birthday of our country. And I think it's a special time for us to think about what is it that we want to to be true about this grand experiment we've been lucky enough to inherit, and that we have responsibility over stewarding.
Yeah. And when you study history, as I know you do, you learn that in fact citizens to step into the political environment periodically and strip away sort of corrupting party power and return it to citizens. And so I think you and I both remain optimistic that this can be a moment both in 2024 as well as 2026 that enough states enact these reforms that we begin to see critical mass of federal elected to begin to operate differently. We begin to get some exemplars of what good looks like, not just sort
Yeah.
of partisan dividing behavior.
And as you know, like it doesn't happen by itself. The only way that these things happen is for when people who are listening to this decide to do something about it. And that's what's so great, I think, about Veterans for All Voters. You have a community of people who are country over party type public servants who've served their country, many of whom are actually disenfranchised by close primaries in many states, saying, enough is enough. I'm going to do something about that. So the way we win and the way we make change is exactly what Veterans for All Voters is doing right now at the state level all around the country.
And it's interesting, and you know this, but we remind our friends that this is not going to be solved. This work is not in Washington, D.C. You can't fix Washington, D.C. from Washington, D.C. You have to go to Reno, Nevada, and Juneau, and cities across this country. I got a text from a friend of mine, Blaine Smith, who started Team RWB, which is a great post 9/11 veterans organization, national organization. And he lives in Maine. He votes in Maine. He said, I was able to vote for the first time as a registered independent. And he was celebrating just the work, and it was made personal to him. So I'm optimistic that citizens are going to pull it together. And I tell people, if Americans could come to understand Senate filibuster rules and have an opinion on that, I think they can come to understand the primary problem that we're facing, and in turn, the primary solution. Um, but let me ask you this: this is sort of the last question, because I think what I appreciate about Unite America, and it's I think our ethos as well, is these are big ideas, but you're very practical and action oriented. We want to get things done in the next several years. We don't want this to be just an ethereal conversation. You want to change the laws to give veterans or to give everyone the right to vote and access elections. Beyond that, what's your vision for success? Getting some states, you identified 6 in which there's opportunities these next couple of cycles. What's like an ultimate vision of success for you and the work of Unite America?
It's for us, as much as we love our election reforms, we view them as a means to an end. And success is our vision, which is a functional and representative government that's capable of solving the major challenges facing the country. So success will look like when we have a Congress that can be successful in representing a majority of Americans and solving some vexing problems that we face, over the next decade. This could be the only way that I think we tackle big challenges, from climate, to AI, to our structural budget deficits right now. So we need a functional Congress to enable a lot of the other progress we can make as a society. And at a practical level, the way that reform can unlock that is, I think over the next decade, we can eliminate closed party primaries in our country. It does not have to be the reality when we enter the next decade. We can eliminate partisan gerrymandering. These are scourges in our democracy right now that I think would be great to look back at 10 years from now and say, we did it. And I think we've done that, as you mentioned, in other aspects of our democracy in the past, when we've reformed aspects of how we vote and how Congress functions. We didn't always used to have a secret ballot when you went to vote. You didn't always elect your United States senator. Of course, not people who didn't look like you and me couldn't vote in the past either. I mean, these are changes that we have made. And so these other goals that I talk about in that context, I think are awfully feasible. And my hope is that as these reforms get implemented, the flywheel begins to spin sort of in the other direction, meaning when we can implement these reforms, maybe the person who never thought about running for office before decides to run. And maybe when they're elected, they can inspire a constituent of theirs, instead of tuning out politics, to actually get engaged. And maybe that person begins to create some demand for media that doesn't just look to outrage them. And over time, instead of being in a vicious cycle of polarization and division in our country, we can enter a more virtuous cycle. And this will take time. It is a long game that we're playing, but guess what? We did not get into the situation we're in right now overnight. We won't get out of it overnight. It depends on what is the dominant dynamics and are they trending in the right direction or not. And I think these reforms can help us change direction and start moving in the right one.
Well, I appreciate that, and everyone I think who's listening to this interview is compelled by that sense of optimism that we can accelerate that flywheel effect, begin it, and through slow turns and slow win or small wins in lots of places, begin to kind of create this movement effect that hopefully takes over the country. Because Americans, we know are distraught, so the data of their displeasure is on our side, and I think we just have to break through, which is why your book is such an important contribution. So, Nick Troiano, this is a great conversation. I want to encourage everyone to go to uniteamerica.org/book, where you can read The Primary Solution, start the conversation in your community, join us at Veterans for All Voters. Know that we are that there is a small but mighty group of folks across the country who are very clear on what the challenge is and how we can impact it, not in the next 50 years, but in the next couple of years. And so encourage you to join us, take action, read the book, start the conversation, and we'll have more information at veteransforallvoters.org as well about Nick's book and how to get involved. So Nick, thanks so much for the time.
Thank you for all you do.
And for your leadership in this movement.